My name is Mia, and I'm 29 years old. 3 years ago, my mother called me 4 days before Thanksgiving and said 6 words that shattered everything. I thought I knew about family. There isn't enough room this year. The silence that followed those words was heavy, filled with the muffled sound of a television in the background of her house. The house I grew up in, I could hear the distant clinking of silverware, the familiar hum of the dishwasher, and the muffled laughter of my sister Victoria in the next room. "What do you mean, Mom?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I was standing in my small florist shop, the scent of damp earth and crushed eucalyptus filling my lungs. My hands were stained green from trimming stems, and the cold November rain was drumming a rhythmic, lonely beat against the storefront window. "Exactly what I said, Mia," she replied, her tone sharpening into that familiar edge of impatience. "Victoria and her husband are staying in your old room. They're bringing the new puppy, and honestly, with the big dinner and the guest list, it's just a lot. We thought it would be easier if you stayed back this time. You're so busy with the shop anyway, right?" "I closed the shop specifically for this, Mom. I already bought my ticket." I felt the prickle of heat behind my eyes. I gripped the edge of the wooden workbench, the rough grain digging into my palms. I looked at the centerpiece. I had been working on a lush arrangement of deep, burgundy dahlias and dried wheat, meant for her table, a gift. "Well, you can get a refund, can't you?" She didn't wait for an answer. "We'll FaceTime you when we cut the turkey. It'll be just like you're there." "I have to go. The oven timer is off." "Love you, honey." The line went dead. I stared at my phone until the screen went black, reflecting my own stunned face back at me. I wasn't just being told not to come. I was being erased from the map. This wasn't the first time I had been the acceptable sacrifice. I was the daughter who stayed quiet so Victoria could scream. I was the one who got the hand-me-down, clothes that were 2 sizes too big, while Victoria got the boutique dresses. I was the one who worked 2 jobs to pay for a college degree while my parents bought Victoria a condo for her graduation. But this felt different. This was a holiday. This was the one time of year when the world tells you that you belong somewhere. I looked around my shop. The buckets of lilies, the rows of shears, the smell of damp moss, it was my sanctuary. But suddenly it felt like a cage. I walked over to the centerpiece, the one I had poured hours into. The dahlias looked like bruised hearts. With a hand that wouldn't stop trembling, I picked up the shears. I didn't trim the stems. I didn't adjust the greens. I simply reached out and snipped the head off the largest, most beautiful flower. It fell to the floor with a soft, wet thud. My phone vibrated on the table. A text from my father. My heart leaped. Maybe he was calling to fix it. Maybe he had overheard and was standing up for me. "Dad, sorry about the room. Mia, you know how your mother gets when she's stressed. We'll make it up to you at Christmas. Love you." He didn't say, "I'll talk to her." He didn't say, "I'll sleep on the couch so you can have my bed." He chose the path of least resistance. He chose his own comfort over his daughter's presence. I didn't reply. I couldn't. The bitter taste of cold coffee sat at the back of my throat, matching the acidity rising in my chest. I walked to the front of the shop and flipped the sign from open to closed. I locked the door and leaned my forehead against the glass. Outside, people were rushing by with umbrellas, their faces tucked into scarves, hurrying toward warm kitchens and shared laughter. I was 29 years old, and for the first time in my life, I realized that home was a place where I was only invited when there was leftover space. Something inside me went quiet. Not sad, not angry, just empty. It was a terrifying kind of stillness, the kind that happens right before a massive tectonic shift. As the darkness of the November afternoon settled over the street, a quiet decision began to form in the hollow spaces of my chest. A decision I didn't even fully understand yet, but one that whispered I was done being an afterthought. The decision didn't just happen in that moment at the shop. It was the final stitch in a tapestry of being overlooked that had been woven since I was small. That night, I sat on my sofa with a glass of wine I didn't really want, staring at an old photo album I'd dragged out of a moving box. I flipped to a page from my 10th birthday. In the photo, Victoria is front and center, blowing out my candles. My mother is laughing, her arm around Victoria's shoulders. I am a blur in the corner, halfway out of the frame, reaching for a piece of my own cake that no one had offered to cut for me yet. The smell of the old adhesive in the album, musty and sharp, hit me like a physical blow. I remembered that day. I had wanted a party at the park, but Victoria had a cold, so we stayed home. Everything was always calibrated to the frequency of her needs. If she was hungry, we all ate. If she was tired, the house went dark. I learned to be a ghost in my own life, navigating the hallways of my childhood like a guest who was overstaying her welcome. I turned the page. High school graduation. I had worked so hard for that valedictorian spot. I remembered the heat of the polyester, gown sticking to my back, and the smell of freshly mown grass on the football field. I looked for my parents in the crowd. When I finally found them, they weren't looking at me. They were huddled together, fussing over Victoria, who had tripped on her way to her seat and ruined her shoes. During my entire speech, the words I had stayed up until 3 a.m. writing. My mother's head was down, cleaning a scuff mark off Victoria's heel with a wet wipe. I closed the album. The thud of the heavy cover echoed in my quiet apartment. The grief came then, not as a sharp cry, but as a slow, cold tide. It was the realization that I wasn't difficult or unlovable. I was just a secondary character in their script. I was the bridge they walked over to get to the person they actually cherished. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my call logs. Aside from the shop and a few friends, it was a graveyard of unreturned messages to my father. Hey, Dad, saw this book and thought of you. No reply. Hey, Dad, I'm feeling a bit down. Do you have 5 minutes? Read at 6:12 p.m. No reply. He loved me, I knew that. But his love was a quiet, cowardly thing. It lived in the shadows of my mother's disapproval. He would squeeze my hand when she wasn't looking, or slip an extra $20 into my card when she was in the other room. But he would never, ever raise his voice to say, Mia deserves to be here. I stood up and walked to the window. The rain had turned to a light, freezing sleet that rattled against the glass like tiny bones. I thought about the golden child life Victoria led. She wasn't a villain, not really. She was just someone who had never been told no. She existed in a world where the sun rose and set according to her schedule. She probably didn't even realize I wasn't coming for Thanksgiving. To her, I was like the wallpaper, present but invisible. Only noticed when there was a tear in the fabric. Realized then that my anger wasn't a fire. It was a compass. It was pointing me away from the wreckage of my past and toward a horizon I couldn't see yet. I grabbed a trash bag. I started with the album, then the hand-me-down sweater my mother had given me last Christmas, the one that was missing a button and smelled like her. Laundry detergent. Then the world's best daughter mug Victoria had bought me as a joke. I sat in my apartment as the sun went down, watching the shadows stretch across my floor until they swallowed everything. My father had a chance to choose me. He had a lifetime of chances. And every single time he chose silence instead. The Thursday of Thanksgiving arrived with a hollow, ringing silence. In the city, the air felt thin and sharp, smelling of wet asphalt and the faint, sweet scent of wood smoke from distant chimneys. Usually, this day was a frantic blur of luggage, crowded airports, and the performative joy of trying to fit into a space that wasn't made for me. But this year, I was still in my pajamas at noon. I tried to keep the TV on to drown out the quiet. But every commercial was a montage of golden brown turkeys, sparkling glassware, and families laughing in slow motion. It felt like a personal taunt. Around 2 p.m., my phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was the promised FaceTime call. I stared at the screen. My mother's face appeared, flushed from the heat of the kitchen, her hair perfectly coiffed. Behind her, the house was aglow of amber light and expensive candles. "Happy Thanksgiving, Mia?" she chirped, rotating the phone to show the table. It was sprawling. Crystal glasses caught the light. And there, right in the center, was a store-bought arrangement of orange carnations. My dahlias, the ones I had poured my soul into, were sitting in a bucket at my shop, rotting. "Look, Victoria's husband brought the most wonderful wine," she continued, panning to Marcus, who waved a bottle at the camera. Victoria was leaning against him, glowing, a silk headband holding back her hair. "Hi, Mia." "Sorry you couldn't make it," Victoria said, though her eyes were already drifting toward a platter of appetizers. "It's so cozy this year with just the inner circle, you know? The inner circle." The words felt like a physical weight pressing against my throat. I looked for my father. He was in the background, carving the turkey, his back to the camera. He didn't turn around. He didn't even wave. "Anyway, we have to go. The rolls are burning." "Love you." The screen went black. I sat there for a long time, the cold phone pressed against my palm. I could taste the bitterness of the lukewarm tea I'd been sipping. It tasted like ash. My apartment felt incredibly small. The radiator clanked and hissed, a lonely sound in the void. I looked at my kitchen counter. I had bought a small, pre-made turkey sandwich from the deli the night before, thinking I'd be fine. But looking at it now, wrapped in its sad plastic crinkle, I felt a wave of nausea. I wasn't fine. I was hitting a floor I didn't know existed. I was the girl who wasn't even worth a folding chair in the hallway. The tears didn't come with a sob. They just leaked out, hot and silent, dripping onto my knees. I felt a sudden, frantic need to move. If I stayed in this silence, I was going to disappear. I was going to fade into the gray walls of this apartment and never be found. I grabbed my coat, the heavy wool one I'd bought for the trip I never took. I didn't bother with makeup or fixing my hair. I just needed to hear another human voice, even if it wasn't directed at me. I needed to see light that wasn't filtered through a smartphone screen. I stepped out into the hallway, the smell of my neighbor's roasting chicken stinging my nose. I walked down the stairs and out into the biting wind. The streets were deserted. Most shops were shuttered, their closed for holiday signs feeling like a personal rejection. I walked for 6 blocks, my boots clicking rhythmically on the frozen pavement, my breath blooming in white puffs before me. My ears were stinging with the cold. But the physical pain was a relief. It was something I could actually manage. I turned a corner and saw a soft, golden glow spilling out onto the sidewalk about half a block ahead. It was a small bistro I'd passed 100 times but never entered. A chalkboard outside, dusted with a light layer of frost, read, "Community table tonight. No one eats alone." I stopped. My heart hammered against my ribs. It felt like a trap or a cruel joke. But the smell, oh, the smell, it was incredible. Slow-roasted garlic, rosemary, and the yeasty, heartwarming scent of fresh bread. I grabbed my coat tighter, pulling the collar up. If I was going to eat Thanksgiving dinner alone, I was going to do it somewhere with actual food, with light, with life. I just had to find the courage to push open the door. The door opened with the chime of a heavy brass bell, and a wall of warmth hit me immediately. It smelled like home, not the home I had just been exiled from, but the one you read about in books. It was the scent of melting butter, sage, and the deep, earthy richness of red wine reduction. The bistro was small, crowded with mismatched wooden tables, but it didn't feel cramped. It felt intentional. Every candle was lit, casting a flickering, amber glow over the faces of people who looked happy, truly happy. Just one? I looked up. A woman stood there, her hair a wild halo of silver curls, wearing an apron over a thick emerald sweater. This was Eleanor. She didn't look at me with the pity I expected for a woman standing alone in a coat on a holiday. She looked at me with a sharp, kind clarity, as if she could see the exact shape of the hole in my heart. Yes, just me, I stammered, my voice raspy from the cold and the hours of silence. Well, just one isn't allowed tonight, she said, her voice a warm rasp. She didn't lead me to a small hidden corner. She walked me straight to the center of the room, to a long trestle table where 8 other people were already seated. "Richard, make some room. We've got a guest." A man with steady, kind eyes and a salt and pepper beard slid his chair over. "Welcome," he said simply. "I'm Richard. This is my wife, Eleanor, the one currently bossing everyone around." "I heard that," Eleanor called out from the kitchen doorway, laughing. I sat down, my hands still trembling as I placed them on the soft linen napkin. To my left was a man named Andrew. He had a camera bag tucked under his chair and eyes that seemed to take in everything. He didn't ask why I was alone. He didn't ask where my family was. He simply handed me a basket of warm, crusty bread. "The rosemary focaccia is life-changing," he whispered with a wink. "Try it before Richard eats it all." I took a piece. It was warm, the salt crystals crunching against my teeth, the olive oil rich and floral. It was the first thing I had tasted all day that didn't feel like ash. As the night unfolded, the community table became a sanctuary. There were no inner circles here. There was a retired teacher, a young nurse who had just finished a double shift, Andrew the photographer, and Richard and Eleanor, who owned the place. They didn't treat the dinner like a charity event. They treated it like a feast for friends they hadn't met yet. For the first time in my life, I wasn't fighting for air. No one interrupted me. No one looked over my shoulder to see if someone more interesting had walked in. When I mentioned I was a florist, Eleanor's eyes lit up. "Richard, did you hear that?" "A florist. I've been trying to get those window boxes to behave for 3 months," she said, leaning in. She touched my arm, a brief, warm contact that made me realize how long it had been since someone had touched me with genuine affection. The conversation flowed like the wine Richard kept pouring. We talked about art, the city, the way the light looks in the park during the first snow. I found myself laughing. a real deep laugh that vibrated in my chest. I had forgotten that I was a person who could be funny, a person who had things worth saying. As the main course was served, a beautiful roasted turkey with apricot stuffing, I felt a vibration in my pocket. I pulled my phone out just enough to see the screen. Group chat, Victoria shared a photo. It was a picture of my family gathered around their table, clinking glasses. My mother was center stage glowing. My chair, the one I usually sat in, was gone. They had rearranged the table so there wasn't even a gap where I should have been. I looked at the screen, and for the first time, the pain didn't have a serrated edge. I looked up at Richard, who was listening intently to the nurse's story about her cat. I looked at Eleanor, who was placing a bowl of steaming mashed potatoes on the table with a proud flourish. I didn't put the phone back in my pocket. I turned it completely off. I set it face down on the table and reached for my glass. The weight that had been crushing my lungs for years didn't disappear, but it shifted. I wasn't at a table where I was tolerated. I was at a table where I was seen. "Everything okay, Mia?" Richard asked quietly, his steady eyes meeting mine. I took a deep breath, the scent of rosemary and candlelight filling me up. "Yes," I said, and for the first time in 29 years, I meant it. Everything is exactly where it needs to be. The days following that Thanksgiving felt like waking up from a long gray sleep. The freezing rain turned into a soft, blanketed snow that muffled the city. But inside Eleanor and Richard's bistro, the air was always humming with life. I started going back. At first, it was under the guise of helping Eleanor with those stubborn window boxes she'd mentioned. I brought over winter jasmine and sturdy evergreens, my fingers working the cold soil while she stood nearby, leaning against the doorframe with a steaming mug of tea for me. "You have a way with things that grow, Mia," she said one Tuesday afternoon. The smell of cinnamon and yeast drifted out from the kitchen. "You listen to them. Most people just want them to look pretty, but you care if they're actually happy. I think everything deserves to be where it can breathe," I replied, wiping a smudge of dirt from my cheek. Eleanor didn't just give me a place to work. She gave me a place to belong. Within weeks, I wasn't just the florist girl. I was the person who helped Richard fix the wobbly leg on table 4. I was the person Eleanor called when she needed a second opinion on a new dessert recipe. The integration into their lives was slow, like a perennial flower finding its footing in new soil. It was in the small things. The way Richard would automatically pull out a chair for me when I walked in, or how Eleanor knew I liked my coffee with just a splash of oat milk and no sugar. One evening, after the dinner rush had faded into a soft glow of candlelight and clinking glass, we sat together at the long trestle table. Andrew, the photographer from that first night, was there too. He had been coming around more often, always finding a reason to sit near me. "My parents called today," I said suddenly, the words feeling heavy on my tongue. The scent of lavender candles flickered between us. Richard paused, his glass halfway to his lips. "And?" "They're planning a big New Year's Eve party. Victoria is announcing something, probably her new business venture. They wanted to know if I could provide the floral arrangements for free. As a favor to the family?" The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was protective. "And what did you tell them?" Eleanor asked, her voice steady and warm. "I haven't answered yet," I admitted. I looked down at my hands. They were no longer trembling. The rough skin from the winter chill and the garden work felt like armor. Usually I would just say yes. I would stay up all night, spend my own money on the best blooms, and drive 3 hours just to see them ignore the work and complain. About the placement, Eleanor reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. Her skin was warm, smelling faintly of vanilla and flower. "Mia, you are a master of beauty. But you cannot bloom in a room where the windows are boarded up." I looked at her, and for the first time, I saw what a mother was supposed to look like. It wasn't about blood or DNA, it was about the person who looks at you and sees your worth before you even see it yourself. That night, for the first time in my life, I sent a text to the family group chat that didn't include an apology. "Mia, I won't be able to do the flowers for the party. I'm actually quite busy with my own projects here. I hope you all have a wonderful night." I put the phone in my drawer and walked back to the table. Andrew was showing Richard some photos he'd taken of the shop, and Eleanor was humming a low tune as she polished the silverware. The heater hissed, the smell of wood smoke was in the air, and for the first time, the quiet storm inside me began to feel less like a threat, and more like a beginning. I was learning that trust isn't built in grand gestures. It's built in the quiet moments, when someone chooses to stay, when they could have walked away. And as I looked at Eleanor and Richard, I realized I wasn't just a guest anymore. I was becoming part of the foundation. The winter frost began to melt into a tentative, pale spring, and as the ground softened, so did the world around me. The bistro became the heartbeat of my days. I spent my mornings at the flower market, but my afternoons were spent at the community table, where the air always smelled of fresh yeast and hope. The bond with Eleanor and Richard had grown into something solid and rhythmic. They didn't just invite me to dinner, they invited me into their history. They shared stories of their struggles opening the bistro, the years they spent lean and hungry, and the joy they found in building a chosen family. But it was Andrew who truly began to change the landscape of my heart. He started showing up at my flower shop with 2 cups of coffee, black for him, oat milk for me, and a new lens he wanted to test out. He'd spend hours sitting on a stool in the corner, capturing the way the light hit the petals or the way my brow furrowed when I was wrestling with a difficult arrangement of snapdragons and ivy. One rainy Tuesday, the shop smelling of wet pavement and crushed lilies, Andrew put his camera down. The silence between us was comfortable, punctuated only by the snip-snip of my shears. "You look different when you're here," he said softly. I paused, a stem of white jasmine in my hand. "Different how?" "Safe," he replied, walking closer. "When I first met you at the bistro, you looked like you were waiting for someone to tell you to leave. Now you look like you own the ground you're standing on." He reached out, his hand hovering for a second before he gently tucked a stray lock of hair behind my ear. His touch was warm, steady, and entirely focused on me. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to shrink. I didn't feel like a secondary character waiting for the lead to enter the room. I was the lead. "I've spent a long time being an afterthought, Andrew," I whispered. "Not to me," he said. "To me, you're the whole story." That night, we walked to the bistro together, our fingers interlaced. The cold air didn't bite anymore. It felt like a promise. Inside, Eleanor was setting out candles. She looked up, saw our joined hands, and a smile spread across her face. Not a surprised smile, but a knowing one. "About time," Richard grunted from the bar, though his eyes were twinkling behind his glasses. We sat down, and for the first time, the quiet storms of my past felt like they were finally settling into a calm, deep sea. I was surrounded by people who chose me first. Not because they had to, not because of a shared surname, but because they loved the person I was when I stopped trying to be invisible. Safety, I realized, wasn't just the absence of conflict. It was the presence of people who wouldn't let you face the conflict alone. I felt a joy so sharp it almost hurt. A blooming sense of belonging that no cold phone call or excluded holiday could ever take away again. But as the joy deepened, so did the realization that I was living 2 lives. The one I was building in the light, and the one I still carried in the shadows of my biological family's silence. And I knew eventually those 2 worlds would have to collide. By the time the cherry blossoms began to paint the city in soft, pale pinks, Andrew and I knew there was no need for grand, sweeping declarations. Our love had grown like the perennials I tended, quietly, deeply, and with roots that had already survived the frost. When he asked me to marry him, it wasn't at a crowded party or a loud event. We were in the back of my shop, the air smelling of wet moss and sweet peas, our hands sticky with sap. He simply took my hand and said, "I want to be the person who chooses you every single day, for the rest of our lives." But as we began to plan, a familiar cold shadow crept in. Every time I looked at a guest list, my chest tightened. The thought of inviting my biological family felt like inviting a storm into a glass house. One evening at the bistro, as Eleanor was helping me look at fabric swatches for my dress, she noticed I was staring blankly at the table. The smell of roasted lamb and rosemary wafted from the kitchen. Usually my favorite, but today it made me feel slightly nauseous. "Mia," she said, her voice like a steady anchor. "What's wrong?" "I don't want them there, Eleanor," I whispered, the confession feeling like a sin. I don't want my mother's criticism or Victoria's shadow over my wedding, but I feel like I have to. They're family. Richard, who had been quietly cleaning glasses nearby, set a carafe down with a firm thud. "Family is a verb, Mia. It's something people do, not just something they are. If they don't do the work, they don't get the title." Eleanor sat down and took both of my hands in hers. "We have something to talk to you about. Richard and I, we never had children of our own. We've had the bistro, and we've had each other. But since that Thanksgiving night, we've had you." She looked at Richard, who nodded solemnly. "We want to make it official," she continued, her eyes glistening. "In this country, there's something called adult adoption. It doesn't change your past, but it protects your future. It would mean that legally, symbolically, And in every way that matters, you are our daughter. We want you to be a part of our legacy, just as you are part of our hearts. The air in the room seemed to vibrate. I looked at Eleanor, the woman who had fed me when I was empty and seen me when I was invisible. I looked at Richard, the man who had stood guard over my peace, without ever being asked. You want me? I asked, my voice cracking. We chose you, Mia, Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. We chose you that first night, and we've chosen you every night since. The ceremony was small and held in the quiet chambers of a local judge. It smelled of old paper and the fresh lilies I had brought. When the judge signed the papers, I felt a physical weight lift off my shoulders, a weight I had carried since I was a little girl blowing out candles on someone else's cake. I wasn't Mia, the afterthought. I was Mia, the chosen daughter. As we walked out of the courthouse into the bright spring sun, I felt a sense of permanence I had never known. We began planning the wedding with a new sense of freedom. My biological family would be sent invitations out of a sense of final, polite closure, but they wouldn't be sitting in the front row. The front row was already full, but as the invitations went out, the silence from the other side of the city finally broke. The storm I had been dreading was no longer a whisper. It was a roar. The day of the wedding arrived, draped in the soft, golden light of late May. The bistro had been transformed. I had spent the morning filling every corner with white peonies, eucalyptus, and jasmine. The air was thick with the scent of honey and fresh-baked bread. I looked at myself in the mirror. For the first time, the woman looking back didn't look like she was apologizing for taking up space. I wore a simple, elegant silk gown that felt like water against my skin. You look breathtaking, Mia, Eleanor whispered, stepping into the room. She was wearing a deep navy dress, and in her hand, she held a small antique locket. Something old. My mother's. She tucked it into my bouquet. She didn't just look like a mother, she felt like home. The ceremony was supposed to be a private sanctuary. But just as the first notes of the cello began to drift through the room, the heavy brass bell at the entrance chimed with a violent, jagged ring. I froze. I knew that sound. It wasn't the chime of a guest. It was the sound of a demand. My biological mother. Linda marched in, followed by a pale, uncomfortable-looking Robert and a scowling Victoria. They didn't look like wedding guests. They looked like debt collectors. What is the meaning of this, Mia? Linda's voice cut through the soft music like a blade. She held up the invitation, the one that clearly stated they were invited as guests. Not family, a guest seat. After everything we've done for you? After the years we spent raising you? The room went deathly silent. My guests, my real family, looked on with a mix of shock and protective anger. Andrew stepped toward me, his hand reaching for mine, but I held up a finger. I walked toward them. I didn't run. I didn't cry. The quiet storm was no longer inside me. It was standing right in front of them. You weren't invited to be family, Mom, I said, my voice steady, sounding like the ringing of a bell. Because you haven't acted like family in years. You told me there wasn't enough room for me at your table, so I built my own. How dare you? Victoria hissed, her face flushed. You're making this all about you, as usual. Always so sensitive, always the drama. It is about me today, Victoria, I replied, looking her directly in the eyes. For 29 years, it was about you. Your shoes, your college, your room, your tantrums. Today I am the lead, and in my story, there is no room for people who only love me when I'm convenient. My father, Robert, finally spoke, his voice cracking. Mia, please. We're your blood. Blood is just a biological accident. Dad, I said, and for the first time, I felt a twinge of pity for him. But family? Family is a choice. And you chose to be silent every time she erased me. You chose to watch me drown because you didn't want to get your feet wet. I turned to Eleanor and Richard, who were standing just a few feet away, their faces etched with a fierce, unwavering pride. These people, I said, gesturing to the bistro, chose me when I had nothing to offer. They gave me a name when yours felt like a weight. I have been legally adopted by Eleanor and Richard. They are my parents now. The silence that followed was absolute. Linda's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The weapon of guilt had finally lost its edge. Now, I said, my voice softening but remaining firm, you are welcome to sit in the back as guests and witness the life I've built. Or you can leave. But you will not speak another word in this house. Linda looked around the room, realizing for the first time that she had no power here. She wasn't the queen. She was a stranger in a land that didn't recognize her currency. Without a word, she turned and walked out. Victoria trailing behind her, still muttering about ingratitude. My father stayed for a second longer. He looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw a flicker of regret in his eyes. But then he turned and followed them. He chose silence, one last time. I took a deep breath. The air smelled of jasmine again. I turned back to Andrew, who was waiting for me at the end of the aisle. I walked toward him, and this time I didn't look back. The door had closed, and for the first time in my life, I was on the right side of it. The weeks following the wedding felt like the first deep breath after a lifetime of underwater swimming. The noise had stopped. The constant buzzing anxiety of wondering when the next blow would come, or when I would be forgotten again, had simply evaporated. I sat in the back garden of the bistro, the late June air thick with the scent of blooming honeysuckle and sun-warmed bricks. On the table sat a stack of letters. Some were from old family friends, confused by the change in dynamics, but one was from my father. I opened it slowly. The paper smelled like his old study, cedar and stale tobacco. "Mia, I don't know how we got here," it read. "I hope you find the happiness you're looking for." I looked at the words and felt nothing, no anger, no longing, just the peaceful observation of a stranger's handwriting. He still didn't know how we got there, because to know would mean admitting his own part in the silence. I set the letter down and picked up my shears. I had a new life to prune, and there was no room for dead wood. My relationship with Eleanor and Richard had settled into a beautiful, sturdy rhythm. We were no longer the owners and the girl from the flower shop. We were a family unit. We had Sunday brunches where we argued over the best way to make hollandaise sauce, and quiet Tuesday nights where we sat on the porch, watching the fireflies. "You're glowing, Mia," Eleanor said, stepping out onto the patio with a tray of iced tea. The clinking of the ice cubes was a cheerful, bright sound in the afternoon heat. And it's not just the wedding bliss. I looked down at my hands, resting on my stomach. I hadn't told her yet. I hadn't even told Andrew. But the quiet storm inside me had been replaced by a different kind of life, a gentle, rhythmic pulse that was entirely new. "I think I'm ready to start our own traditions," I whispered, looking up at her. Eleanor's eyes widened, and she sat down heavily in the wicker chair next to me. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly as she touched my arm. "Mia, are you?" "I am," I said, a tear of pure, uncomplicated joy tracing a path down my cheek. "And this baby is going to grow up in a house where the doors are always open. They will never have to wonder if there's enough room at the table. They will never be an afterthought." Eleanor pulled me into a hug, and she smelled like flower and lavender and safety. "They will be the center of the world," she promised. She wasn't just survival. It was a rebirth. I was Mia, daughter, wife, florist, and soon a mother. And for the first time, every single one of those titles felt like they belonged to me. That evening, Andrew and I walked through the park. The city was bathed in a bruised purple twilight, the streetlights flickering on like grounded stars. I told him then, under the canopy of an ancient oak tree. He didn't say anything at first. He just pulled me into a kiss that tasted like the future. We were no longer defined by the people who didn't choose us. We were defined by the life we were choosing to build together. I thought about the child growing inside me, a new branch on a tree that had been grafted onto a stronger, kinder root system, the aftermath of the shattering. I sit in the nursery of our new home, the air smelling of fresh cedar and the faint, sweet scent of baby powder. Through the window, the afternoon sun casts long, golden rectangles across the floor. In the corner, there is a rocking chair that Richard spent 3 weekends restoring. And on the wall hangs a framed photograph Andrew took, not of a flower, but of me, Eleanor, and Richard standing in front of the bistro, laughing so hard our eyes are closed. My daughter is asleep in my arms. Her breathing is a soft, rhythmic huff against my chest, a tiny pulse of life that feels like the most important thing in the universe. I look down at her small, perfect fingers and I make her a silent promise. I spent 29 years shrinking. I spent nearly 3 decades believing that my worth was determined by how little I inconvenienced the people I loved. I thought that if I was quiet enough, helpful enough, or invisible enough, I would eventually earn a seat at the table. I was wrong. The greatest lesson I learned wasn't how to survive being overlooked. It was how to stop looking for love in places where the soil was too thin to sustain it. I learned that you cannot bloom in a room where the windows are boarded up, no matter how much you water yourself. My biological family gave me my name, but my chosen family gave me my life. They taught me that love isn't a limited resource that has to be rationed out to the golden few. It's a community table. It's a light left on in the window, It's the person who sees you crying and doesn't ask for an explanation. They just hand you a piece of warm bread and pull out a chair. As I rock my daughter, I realize that the quiet storm wasn't something that happened to me. It was the power building up inside me to finally say no. It was the strength to walk away from a house of shadows and build a home made of light. My daughter will never know what it feels like to be an acceptable sacrifice. She will never hear that there isn't enough room. Because in this family, we don't just make room, we build the table bigger. I press a kiss to her forehead, the sweetness of her skin making my heart ache with a joy that is finally, permanently mine. The past is a closed book, and the future is a garden I am finally ready to tend. CTA section. If you're watching this and you've been the scapegoat of your family, if you've been told you're too much or too sensitive or always causing drama, just because you dared to ask to be treated fairly, I want you to know something. It's not you. It never was. You deserve to be chosen. Not as a backup, not as a last resort, not as the acceptable sacrifice when someone else's comfort is at stake. Chosen first, chosen fully, chosen without conditions. Family isn't blood. Family isn't obligation. Family isn't people who share your DNA but treat you like a burden. Family is the people who show up. The people who see you crying alone and invite you to their table. The people who open their hearts and their homes and make you officially, permanently, undeniably theirs. I spent 29 years trying to earn love from people who were never going to give it. And then I spent 3 years learning what love actually looks like. If this story touched you, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. It helps more people find these stories when they need them most. I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to set boundaries with your own family? Share your experience in the comments. I read every single one. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love knowing how far this story reaches. And if you want more stories like this, check the description. I've linked some of my favorites there. Until next time, remember you deserve to be chosen.